I spent 19 years as a contracts lawyer. Not the glamorous kind. Not the kind you see in movies, arguing inside marble courtrooms with the fate of empires hanging on a single objection. I was the kind who sat in fluorescent-lit offices until 2 in the morning, reading the paragraphs that everyone else signed without reading. The paragraphs that quietly, legally, completely destroyed people. My name is Daniel Morrow, and I was very, very good at my job. The night I died, I was driving home from the office after a 40-hour stretch without sleep, finalizing a merger acquisition that my senior partner had promised a client by morning. The merger wasn't even controversial. The work was routine. It was the kind of contract that a competent first-year associate could have handled. But my senior partner, a man named Gerald Howe, had a habit of delegating difficult work to me and then presenting the results as his own. I had 19 years of documentation proving this. 19 years of timestamps, email trails, billing records, and drafts with my name on them that somehow ended up filed under Gerald's. I'd been building a case, quietly, methodically, the way I did everything. I fell asleep at the wheel 3 blocks from my apartment. I don't remember the impact. What I remember is waking up in a white room, not the blinding, painful white of a hospital, but the clean, geometric white of something that wasn't built for human comfort. It was built for processing. 312 people stood around me in varying states of confusion, fear, and barely suppressed panic. Some I recognized as strangers, a few I recognized as colleagues. One man I recognized immediately, even from across the room, because I'd spent 19 years memorizing the back of his head in boardroom meetings. Gerald Howe. He looked as confused as everyone else, which told me he'd probably died the same way I had, suddenly, without warning, without the dignity of last words. I felt nothing about that. I filed it away as a data point. A system window appeared in front of each of us simultaneously, written in the precise, unambiguous language of legal documentation, which I later realized was not a coincidence. You have died. You have been selected for participation in the convergence protocol. Complete the protocol and your return to life is guaranteed. Fail and the selection is permanent. You may now choose your boon. The room exploded. 312 people rushed the shelves that materialized along the walls, glowing with the light of abilities that would, in theory, help them survive whatever was coming. I watched them fight over fire, over steel skin, over telepathy, over superspeed. I watched Gerald Howe elbow a 19-year-old girl out of the way to grab something called Inferno Mastery, which made his hands burn gold for exactly 3 seconds before fading back to normal. He looked at me across the room. There was nothing on his face, no guilt, no recognition of what he'd done to me for 19 years. Just the flat assessment of a man calculating whether I was worth acknowledging. I turned back to the shelves. The abilities at the front were gone within 90 seconds. I moved to the back. Most of what remained were support-type boons, field medicine, enhanced endurance, minor elemental tricks that wouldn't help much in a direct fight. And then in the very last slot on the very last shelf, sitting between a boon called Enhanced Digestion and something labeled Mild Photosynthesis, was a slim leather portfolio. Brown. Ordinary. The kind that sits on a conference room table for 8 hours of contract review. The system tag attached to it read, Notary Supreme. Passive, the bearer may author, witness, and enforce binding agreements. All parties who sign a binding agreement are subject to its clauses for the duration specified. Violation of a binding agreement triggers automatic penalties as written. Rank, F range, touch. I picked it up. From 3 shelves over, Gerald Howe laughed, a short, incredulous bark. A notary boon? Morrow, you're actually going to die out there with a clipboard. Several people around him laughed too. A young man named Callum Park, who'd grabbed something called Void Blade, shook his head with open pity. Man, that's brutal. What are you going to do? File a complaint against the zombies? I opened the portfolio. Inside was a single blank page, cream white, with a faint watermark at the center, a set of scales. I said nothing. I'd spent 19 years letting people underestimate paperwork. I knew exactly how that ended. The convergence dropped us into a city that had been mid-collapse for approximately 6 hours. The system gave us basic orientation. An apocalypse had been in progress for 6 months in this world's timeline. Infrastructure was failing. Power grids were down in most districts. The population had been reduced by approximately 60% through a combination of a viral outbreak, resource wars, and the arrival of what the system called convergence entities, creatures that had crossed through dimensional breaches when the event began. Translation: zombies, monsters, and 6 months of humans at their absolute worst. The 312 of us scattered immediately. Survival instinct doesn't wait for strategy. I didn't scatter. I sat down on a broken curb outside the drop zone, a collapsed parking structure on the east side of a city called Veridin, and I read the portfolio cover to cover. Most people don't read contracts. That's the first and most fatal mistake they make. The Boon description in the system window had said binding agreement without specifying what binding actually meant in physical terms. That ambiguity was either a flaw or a feature. In my experience, it was always a feature for whoever had written the document. So I read. By the time I finished, 3 things had become clear. First, a binding agreement would enforce itself. The system would not ignore a violation and wait for me to notice. The moment a party acted against a clause they had signed, the system would apply whatever penalty I had written into the document. I didn't need to be present. I didn't need to be watching. The agreement itself was self-executing. Second, the penalties I could write were limited only by the language I used. The system would enforce exactly what was written, no more, no less. Vague language meant vague enforcement. Precise language meant surgical enforcement. This was not an ability, it was a craft. Third, and most importantly, there was a subsection at the bottom of the last page that the system description hadn't mentioned. In small print, the kind that only a contracts lawyer would bother reading, was a clause I would spend the next 2 years using to reshape the world. A binding agreement may be authored with the system itself as a co-signatory, provided the agreement meets the threshold of world-altering consequence. Such agreements are absolute. The system does not breach its contracts. I read that 3 times. Then I stood up, found a working pen in a nearby abandoned office, and started writing my first agreement. The first person I contracted with was a woman named Sira Voss. She was a former city transit engineer who'd survived the first 6 months of the apocalypse through a combination of methodical resourcefulness and the fact that she knew every underground tunnel in Veridin by memory. She found me sitting on a piece of rubble, writing in a leather portfolio, and she made the extremely reasonable assumption that I'd lost my mind. "What are you doing?" she said. She had a fire axe in one hand and the expression of someone who had stopped asking polite questions about 3 months ago. "Writing a contract," I said. "Why?" "Because I need an ally I can trust, and trust requires infrastructure." She stared at me for a long moment. "Your boon is what, exactly?" "Contracts." She absorbed this, like you write contracts in the apocalypse. "Binding agreements," I said, "which is different." "How?" "Read this." I handed her the first agreement I drafted. It was simple, 1 page, plain language, mutual terms. She would share knowledge of the tunnel network. I would provide documented legal protection that physically prevented either of us from betraying the other. I had written the enforcement clause carefully. Any party who acts against the interests of the other, as defined by the below provisions, shall find that their own body refuses to complete the intended harmful action. Duration of refusal, proportionate to severity of intended harm. Sira read it twice. This is either the most useful thing in the apocalypse or the dumbest. "Sign it and find out." She signed. She tried to test it immediately, not to hurt me, she said later, just to see if it worked, by making a very small attempt to pick my pocket. Her hand froze 6 inches from my jacket. She looked at her own hand like she'd never seen it before. "All right," she said, "I'm listening." By the end of the first week, the portfolio held 12 agreements. Sira, a field medic named Bram who'd been hiding in a hospital basement. A family of 4, parents and 2 teenagers, who had supplies but no combat ability. A retired military officer named Captain Joel Reyes, who was the most skeptical person I'd ever presented a contract to, and who signed only after 45 minutes of interrogation about every clause. She became the most important person on my team. The agreements I wrote for each of them were different, tailored. Because that was the other thing nobody had figured out about my ability. It wasn't just enforcement, it was terms. You could build anything into a contract if you understood what each party actually wanted, and you were willing to draft precisely enough to give it to them. Joel wanted command structure. I gave it to her, a clause establishing her as the designated field commander for any physical engagement, with clearly defined authority limits, and a provision that prevented me from undermining her decisions in the field. In exchange, she committed her military expertise to the group's defense indefinitely. Bram wanted supply security. I built him a guaranteed ration structure that couldn't be revoked without his consent, along with a clause preventing any party from sequestering medical supplies without documented justification. The teenagers' twins named Pip and Rook wanted to be treated as adults with agency. I wrote it in, explicitly. Every clause that applied to adults applied to them. You give people the thing they actually need, instead of the thing that's convenient for you, and they will build your walls with their bare hands. Gerald Howe showed up at the end of week 2. He was leading 11 people by then, which was impressive in its own way. Gerald had always known how to get people to work for him. The trouble was he'd never understood the difference between for him and with him. He came to offer me a deal, his words. Daniel, he spread his hands like he was making an opening statement. I know we didn't have the smoothest working relationship, but you were the best contracts man I ever met, and I've got 11 able bodies. You've got 12. Together, that's 23, enough to hold a district. I said, I remember the Halcyon merger, Gerald. He paused. That was years ago. I documented it. I have timestamps. If we ever get back to a world with courts, I have 19 years of documentation that will cost you everything you own. The smile he was wearing got very thin. Daniel. I'll make you a deal, I said. One agreement, simple terms. I slid a page across the table. He picked it up. The terms were straightforward. Gerald's group would merge into the compact under Joel's field command. Gerald would be given an administrative role. Gerald would receive the same supply security as every other compact member. The clause he almost didn't read, 4th paragraph, 2nd sentence, standard subordinate clause, specified that as a condition of the agreement, Gerald Howe permanently surrendered any claim to leadership of the group, and any attempt to seize authority without consensus would result in his Boon being suspended for 30 days per attempt. He didn't read the 4th paragraph. He never read past the 1st page. He signed. I watched him sign his own power away without even knowing it, and felt something I hadn't felt in 19 years working for him. Satisfied. By month 2, the compact had 64 members. Word had spread, not about me specifically, but about what it meant to be inside the compact's territory. Nobody stole. Nobody cheated rations. Nobody put their boot on someone else's throat in the night because they were bigger or stronger or had a better Boon. The agreements were everywhere, covering everything from supply distribution to dispute resolution to what happened if 2 members fell in love and then fell out of it. People came to me with problems, and I wrote solutions. A carpenter named Felix had survived 6 months alone because he didn't trust anyone. He needed to trust someone, or he was going to die from the compounding stress of complete isolation. He told me this flatly, like he was reading from a damage report on himself. I wrote him a compact integration agreement with an unusual clause. Felix Rohn may withdraw from any group activity without explanation and without social penalty. In exchange, Felix Rohn will share his construction knowledge for the benefit of the group. No time commitment, no minimum hours, just share what you know when you're willing, and we won't make you feel bad for needing space. Felix built us a fortified watchtower in 4 days. He kept building after that. Nobody asked him to. We called the territory the Charter District because every building in it had an agreement posted at the entrance. Joel thought it was strange. Sierra said it was the most psychologically clever thing she'd ever seen. You're not building a community, she told me one night, looking out from the watchtower at the lit streets below. You're building a civilization, a small one, but still. That's the plan, I said. For what? I thought about the subsection at the bottom of the portfolio, the one about world-altering consequence and the system as co-signatory. I haven't decided yet, I said, which was a lie. I'd decided in week 1. I just needed to rank up first. Callum Park, the man who had laughed at me in the Boon selection room with void blade burning in his hand, found Charter District in month 3. He didn't come to join. He came with a proposal. His group of 22 was called the Edgerunners, and they operated through a simple system. They were the most effective combat unit in Veridan's West Side, and they charged protection fees to survivor settlements in exchange for zombie clearance. Cash, if settlements still had it. More often, supplies or labor. Callum himself was genuinely good at what he did. The Void Blade Boon gave him the ability to project a cutting edge from any object he held: a pen, a ruler, a toothbrush, with the force and sharpness of an industrial blade. He was fast, ruthless, and tactically sharp in a way that pure combat boons often weren't. He sat across from me at the Charter District's council table and outlined his proposal with the confidence of someone who had never needed to negotiate before, because his arguments had always come with sharp edges attached. "You've got a well-organized setup here," he said. "Impressive, honestly. I laughed at you in that room, and I'll admit I was wrong about the ability. But here's the reality. Charter District has 64 people and growing infrastructure and 0 offensive capability. My 22 have the offensive capability of a small army and 0 organizational infrastructure. Those two things together make something neither of us can build alone." It was a reasonable argument. More than reasonable, it was correct. "What are your terms?" I said. "Equal leadership. I run combat operations. You run administration. Decisions that affect the whole group get split down the middle." I said, "I'll draw up an agreement." He blinked. "You can just say yes, I don't need a contract." "Everyone says that," I said, "right up until they need it." He shrugged. "Fine, I'll sign." The agreement took me 2 hours to draft. Not because the terms were complex, they weren't, but because Callum had said something in passing during our meeting that I needed to address in the document's foundation before anything else. He'd said, "Decisions that affect the whole group get split down the middle." The word split was doing a lot of work in that sentence. It implied equal veto power, which in practice meant deadlock every time we disagreed. And we would disagree. Two people with fundamentally different worldviews always do. I wrote a different structure. A 3-stage resolution system: consultation, mediation, binding arbitration by a neutral third party drawn from compact membership by lottery. Neither of us had a veto. Both of us had a voice. The group had the final say. Callum read the draft. He read it slowly, which told me he was smarter than he'd let on. "This limits my authority," he said. "It limits both of our authorities," I said. "In exchange, it makes the decisions we do make unbreakable, because they come through a process that 64 people have already agreed to honor." He was quiet for a moment. "You really thought about this?" "For 19 years, I said. He signed. The first time someone tried to break a compact agreement, it was one of Callum's former edgerunners, a man named Das who'd never fully accepted that his old protection fee business model was over. Das cornered a compact member in a supply corridor and demanded a private arrangement, extra rations off the books, or he'd make life uncomfortable. He didn't get to finish the sentence. The enforcement clause I'd written into Callum's integration agreement covered all edgerunner members. Any member who uses coercion, threat, or force against a fellow compact signatory shall lose access to their own boon for a period of 7 days, and shall be subject to review by the Compact Council. Das's boon enhanced grip strength shut off mid-sentence. He felt it go. Everyone nearby felt the system chime. He stood there with his hand extended, suddenly ordinary, and every single person in that corridor staring at him. He left Charter District by nightfall. He didn't ask to come back. Word of what happened spread faster than I expected, not just inside the compact, outside it too. Because there was something about watching an ability simply turn off, because of a document, because of language on paper, that hit people somewhere deeper than violence ever could. Violence, they'd all seen plenty of. They'd built entire psychological architectures around managing their fear of it. They had no architecture for this. His name was Konstantin Vrel. In the first 6 months before our arrival, he had been a district police commander. When the convergence hit and the city started falling apart, he had done what a certain kind of strong-willed, hierarchically minded man always does when legitimate authority collapses. He built his own. The Iron Wardens occupied Veridan's northern districts, 11 square miles of the most defensible urban terrain in the city, including the water treatment plant, the main food distribution warehouse, and the only fully functional hospital. Konstantin ran it like a feudal state. Those with combat boons served as wardens, those without served as workers. The workers received protection and basic rations in exchange for labor. The wardens received privilege in exchange for enforcement. He was not evil. That was the important thing to understand about Konstantin Vrel. He was not a villain in the way that stories usually need their antagonists to be. He was a man who genuinely believed that what he'd built was the best possible outcome for the people in it, and he was not entirely wrong. He was wrong about one thing. He believed that the hierarchy he'd created was the only way to maintain order. He'd never met a contracts lawyer. Konstantin's first contact with Charter District was a letter, delivered by a warden carrying a white flag, in the tradition of someone who'd watched too many historical dramas but wasn't entirely without irony. The letter outlined a cooperation proposal. The wardens would provide Charter District with access to the water treatment plant's output at a cost of 30% of our agricultural production. In exchange, the wardens would not consider Charter District a rival power. That last sentence was doing a lot of work. Joel read the letter, then looked at me. That's a tribute demand wrapped in corporate language. Yes, I said, he's good. He's threatening us. He's testing us, I said. There's a difference. I wrote a response. In it, I thanked Konstantin for his proposal and counteroffered a mutual non-aggression agreement with water access and agricultural surplus shared according to a formula based on population and need, rather than fixed percentages. I attached a draft agreement for his review. The warden carrying the response read the cover letter over his commander's shoulder and said, "Sir, they sent a contract." Konstantin stared at it. "I know what it is." "What do you want to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to meet this Daniel Morrow." He came to Charter District with 8 wardens and the energy of a man who had never, in his life, walked into a room he didn't intend to control. I had coffee ready. Real coffee. Compact Traders had found a sealed warehouse of it 3 weeks prior. I'd made sure the meeting room smelled like the thing that, more than almost anything else, reminded people of a world that still had rules. Konstantin sat down. He looked at the portfolio in my hands. He looked at me. "You're the notary," he said. "I prefer architect," I said, "but yes." "Your letter said you wanted a partnership." "I want a binding agreement between our territories," I said, "which is a specific kind of partnership." "And if I say no?" "Then nothing happens," I said. "We're not strong enough to threaten you militarily, and you know it, but you wouldn't have come here if nothing happens was your preferred outcome." He studied me. Konstantin Vrel had the eyes of a man who had spent his entire career reading people, and the slight narrowing around them told me he hadn't decided whether I was brilliant or simply fortunate. "What exactly does a binding agreement mean?" he said, mechanically. I explained it. He listened without interrupting, which was more discipline than most people showed. When I finished, he said, "So you're telling me that if I sign a document promising not to attack you, my own Boon will physically prevent me from doing it?" "Yes." "And you'd be in the same position?" "Yes." "Why would I give up that kind of freedom?" "Because freedom without trust is just loneliness with better weapons," I said. "You have 11 square miles, you have water and medicine. You don't have enough people to run all of it at full efficiency, and you know it because you've been running it at 60% capacity since month 4 and the gaps are getting worse. You need allies you can actually rely on. Not subordinates, allies." The room was very quiet. "You researched my operational capacity," he said. "I research everything before I draft a document," I said. "It's in my nature." He reached across the table and picked up the draft agreement. He read it for 11 minutes without speaking. I counted. "Third clause," he said. "You've written that disputes are resolved by a council drawn from both territories." "Yes." "That limits my unilateral authority over my own people." "Only in disputes with compact members," I said. "Internal warden matters stay internal." Fourth clause, water distribution formula based on population. "Yes." "That will disadvantage the wardens as your population grows." "The formula adjusts every quarter," I said, "and the adjustment mechanism is right there in the subsection." He found the subsection. "Read it." "You want this to scale," he said slowly. "You're not building a deal between 2 groups. You're building a system that can absorb more groups." "Yes," I said. He put the document down. He looked at me for a long moment. How many groups are you planning to absorb? All of them, I said, eventually. Konstantin Vrel signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in month 4 of the convergence. He was the single most important signature I ever obtained, and not because of his territory or his resources. It was because Konstantin was the kind of man other people followed. When word got out that the Iron Warden had signed with the compact, that he had looked at what I was building and decided it was worth trusting, 12 smaller factions sent representatives to Charter District within the next 2 weeks. Gerald Howe, in his administrative role, processed the new member intake forms. He didn't complain about it. The agreement he'd signed didn't technically prevent him from complaining, but there was a psychological shift that happened to people who had signed away their ability to seize power without realizing it. Something quiet and deflating. He processed the forms, he did it well, he had always been competent. He just wasn't in charge. Month 7. The system had been giving us breach notifications in the north for 3 weeks. Not zombie swarms, something larger, something moving with purpose. Callum brought me the scout reports over breakfast. He spread them across the table the way he used to spread blade patterns in his fighting drills, methodically, building toward a point. It's not a horde, he said. Hordes don't have formations, hordes don't send scouts. I looked at the reports. Movement patterns, territorial claims, a specific behavior the scouts had noted with visible discomfort, clusters of zombies that appeared to be waiting, standing still, organized. Has anyone had direct contact? I asked. 2 scouts from the Warden Border Patrol, Joel said. They reported the lead entity, whatever it is, stopped moving when it saw them, looked at them, then turned around and left. That's not zombie behavior, Sierra said. No, I agreed. So what is it? I thought about the Boon subsection I'd memorized in week 1. Provided the agreement meets the threshold of world-altering consequence. I thought about what consequence required and what world-altering meant in practice. I need to meet it, I said. Everyone in the room went silent in the specific way that people go silent when the person they trust most says something that sounds insane. Joel said, Daniel. I need to meet it, I said again, alone. I went north on a Thursday morning with the portfolio under my arm and a pen in my breast pocket. I found it at the edge of what had been Veridan's main commercial district, a figure standing at the center of a plaza, surrounded by perhaps 300 zombies arranged in a rough semicircle, all of them absolutely still. It looked like a man. It had been a man once. The system register I'd managed to pull from compact records identified it as Elias Morrow, age 41, former urban planner for Veridan's City Development Office. My brother. I had not known Elias was in Veridan. He'd moved here 8 years ago, and we'd lost contact the way that people who are both very busy and not very good at relationships lose contact, gradually, mutually, without anyone deciding to end anything. He was standing in the plaza looking at me with eyes that were mostly red now, the iris bleed that came with full convergence entity integration. The virus had taken him and built something new inside. But he was standing still, he was waiting. The zombies around him were waiting. I sat down on a broken fountain ledge across from him. I put the portfolio on my knee. I know you can understand me, I said. The scouts said you looked at them before you left. Entities at your stage don't do that. They react, but they don't look. He didn't speak. The entities around him shifted slightly, a collective restlessness, like a tide adjusting. I'm going to talk to you anyway, I said, because you're my brother and because I came here to make you an offer. I opened the portfolio. I can't cure you, I said. I want to be honest about that. I don't know if what's happened to you is reversible, but I know that you're still in there because something that had lost its mind entirely would have attacked me by now, and you haven't. I started writing, not looking at him, just writing. I'm going to draft an agreement, I said as I wrote. Between you and the compact, the terms are simple. Your territory, the North Districts, whatever you've been protecting, stays yours. We won't send people into it without notification. In exchange, your entities won't push south. We share the breach points, the places where new entities are crossing in because fighting them apart is going to get everyone killed. I finished the draft. I slid it across the cracked fountain basin toward him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up. The entities around him made a sound I'd never heard before, not aggression, something else. Something that made me think of the sound a room of people makes when something unexpected happens, and no one is sure yet if it's good or bad. He read it. I watched him read it. His eyes moved across the page with the slow, deliberate focus of someone fighting for comprehension through a medium that wasn't designed for them anymore. When he reached the last clause, he stopped. I'd written it specifically for him. This agreement acknowledges that the entity known as Elias Morrow retains personhood under the Compact's legal framework, regardless of biological classification. His rights as a person are binding on all Compact signatories. He looked up at me. I held out the pen. It took him 30 seconds to get his hand around it. The coordination wasn't easy anymore. But he signed. A shaky, half-recognizable version of the signature I remembered from birthday cards sent years ago when we still did that. The system chimed. Binding agreement executed. Parties, Daniel Morrow, Compact and Entity Classification, Convergent Sovereign, ELIAS Morrow. Agreement threshold, world-altering consequence confirmed. System co-signatory status, active. The entities behind my brother didn't attack, that day or any day after. They held the northern breaches. Month 11. The system announced it 3 days before it happened. Phase 3 of the Convergence Protocol. A primary breach event will open in Veridan's Central District in 72 hours. Scale, categorical. All surviving factions should prepare accordingly. Categorical meant city ending. Categorical meant the kind of entity that had destroyed other cities entirely in the months before our arrival. The system's damage projections, when I found them buried in a status update, suggested that without coordinated defense, Veridan had approximately a 6% survival rate. I called a summit. Every faction that had signed with the Compact attended. Konstantin Vrel came personally, his 12 Warden Honor Guard positioned outside the conference hall. 3 other warlords I'd spent months negotiating agreements with came with their leadership teams. 16 smaller settlement leaders were there via radio relay. And in a specific arrangement I'd negotiated 2 weeks prior, Elias attended, standing at the far end of the room, with 2 of his steadiest entities at his sides, and the rest of the Northern Compact observing via radio. I stood at the front of the room and said, "The primary breach is going to open in Veridan's Central Plaza in 68 hours. No single faction can survive it. Our models suggest that even full coordination gives us approximately a 43% survival rate, which is better than 6, but not good enough." The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that means everyone is doing math and not liking the answers. "I have a proposal," I said. I opened the portfolio. I've drafted a sovereign charter, a binding agreement of a type that has never been executed before. A compact with the system itself as co-signatory. The terms: every faction in this room commits total combat resources to a coordinated defense of the Central Plaza breach point under a single unified command structure for the duration of the breach event. No holdbacks, no private reserves. Every boon, every soldier, every piece of equipment committed to the breach. "That leaves our home territories defenseless," one of the warlords said. A woman named Jira, who ran the South Riverside camps. "Yes," I said, "that's the sacrifice the terms require." "And what happens if someone doesn't show up? What happens if someone pulls their people back to protect their own territory once the breach opens?" I said, "That's what the Sovereign Charter Clause covers. A compact at this scale, countersigned by the system, is not optional. Any party who signs and then pulls back will have their boon suspended for the duration. Any party who refuses to sign will find that the system does not recognize their territorial claims after the breach event, regardless of outcome." The room erupted. I let it run for 3 minutes, long enough for people to exhaust their initial objections and start actually thinking. Then Konstantin Vrel stood up. The room went quiet. Konstantin had that effect. "I'm signing," he said, "because I know what Morrow's agreements have done for this city, and because 6% is not a number I'm willing to accept when 43 is on the table." He looked at me. "Who's commanding the unified force?" "Captain Reyes," I said. "Field command is not my domain. I'll be at the breach point for a different reason." Everyone turned to look at Joel, who had been standing at the back of the room with her arms crossed. She nodded once, with the expression of someone who had already been planning the defense strategy for 48 hours. One by one, the faction leaders came to the table. Gerald Howe was the last one in the room. He stood across from me, looking at the portfolio, and said, "You planned this from the beginning, didn't you?" "Not the specifics," I said. "But this, the compact, the agreements, this end result." He shook his head slowly. "You always said the fine print was where the real deal happened." "You never listened," I said. He picked up the pen. "I'm listening now," he said. He signed. The breach opened at 3:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. I was standing at the edge of the central plaza when it happened, a vertical tier in the air 40 meters tall and widening, the kind of dimensional wound that doesn't close on its own. Things were coming through it. Large things, the kind of things that ended cities. Behind me, Joel's unified force was already in position. Callum's edgerunners on the flanks, Constantine's wardens forming the front line, Elias entities at the southern perimeter holding the civilian evacuation corridors. The first wave hit. I won't describe the battle in detail. Joel's account, which she wrote out afterward and I still have in the archive, does it more justice than I could. What I will describe is what I was doing while it happened. I was writing. The Sovereign Charter clause I'd withheld from the summit, the one I hadn't mentioned because explaining it would have taken longer than they had patience for, was the system co-signatory provision. What it meant in practice. With the system's seal on the charter, I could author new clauses in real time, and they would take effect immediately for all signatories, without requiring new signatures. I used it. When the eastern flank started folding under the pressure of a convergence entity that Callum's void blade couldn't cut fast enough, I wrote a clause. Callum Park may temporarily extend void blade range to 30 meters for the duration of the eastern breach pressure. The system chimed, Callum's blade extended, the entity fell. When the warden frontline needed to hold a position they were physically unable to hold without relief, I wrote a clause. Constantin Vrel and all warden signatories receive a 40% endurance enhancement for the duration of the breach event. The system chimed, they held. I wrote 11 clauses over 4 hours, each one precise, each one calibrated to what was needed, not what was wanted. No clause gave anyone an ability they couldn't already use. The Sovereign Charter had limits, and I understood them. But every clause pushed existing abilities to their documented maximum and held them there. At 7:28 a.m., the breach closed. Not because we destroyed everything that came through, we hadn't. It closed because the compact had held the line long enough for the system's own repair mechanism to activate. The Charter had bought the time. The people had done the rest. The plaza looked like the site of a battle. It was the site of a battle, but the city was standing. I sat down on a piece of rubble and wrote one final clause in the portfolio. The convergence protocol is concluded. All surviving signatories of the Veridan Sovereign Charter are hereby recognized as permanent legal residents of this world, with full rights under the framework established by the Compact. The system acknowledges receipt of this conclusion. The system didn't chime this time. The sky did something instead. A sound like paper turning, enormous and everywhere, and then a light, not dramatic, not blinding, just a slow brightening. The way dawn comes when you've been awake all night, and you're too tired to find it beautiful, but you find it beautiful anyway. We went back. Not all of us. Some had been here long enough that back no longer meant what it used to. But the system kept its word, the way a contract keeps its word when it's been properly written, and the people who wanted to return, returned. I woke up in a hospital room. The accident apparently had not been fatal or had become unfatal, which is a distinction I decided not to think about too carefully. There was a nurse. There was a window. There was the muffled, ordinary sound of a city that had no idea what cities were capable of being. The portfolio was in my lap. Not the system's version, the physical one, leather, brown, slightly worn at the spine from 11 months of constant use. The pages inside were blank. The agreements weren't there. But the pen was. And in the front cover, in handwriting that wasn't mine, was a single sentence. Elias handwriting. A little shaky, a little uncertain, the way it always had been even before. Come find me when you're well. I have things to tell you. I found out later what had happened to Gerald Howe. He'd survived, He'd returned. He'd walked back into the firm, into his corner office, and lasted approximately 4 days before he called me. He didn't ask for anything, he just said, "I read the Halcyon contract, the original with your timestamps." I waited. "I never said thank you," he said. "For any of it, I'm saying it now for what it's worth." It was worth something, not everything, but something. I filed it away as a data point on the positive side of the ledger. Some debts aren't financial, but they all have terms. A year after the convergence, I opened a practice. Not contracts law, or not just contracts law. Something broader. A service for the people who had come back changed and needed help putting the change into language. Putting the things that had happened into frameworks that made sense in a world that still had courtrooms and traffic jams and coffee that came from a machine, not a warehouse Sierra had found in month 2. On the wall of my office, I had framed the first agreement I'd ever written. The one with the mutual non-harm clause. The one Sierra had signed and then tried to pick my pocket to test. Below it, I had framed Gerald's signature on the Sovereign Charter. Below that, the Convergence Protocol's final record. System letterhead. The system's own seal in the corner, which nobody on this side of the divide would ever understand the significance of. Joel came to visit on the day I opened. She looked around the office, at the framed agreements on the wall, and shook her head. "You know, most people are trying to forget what happened," she said. "I know," I said. "You're building a monument." "I'm building a record," I said. "There's a difference." She looked at the first agreement for a long time. "Do you think you could have done it without that, Boon?" I thought about 19 years of contracts that nobody read until it was too late. I thought about Gerald signing away his authority without reading the 4th paragraph. I thought about Constantine reading every clause and signing anyway. I thought about Elias holding a pen with hands that weren't quite right anymore and signing his own personhood back into existence. "The Boon gave me enforcement," I said. "The 19 years gave me the language. Take either one away and it doesn't work." She nodded. "And what would you have picked if you'd known what was coming?" I picked up the pen from my desk. "The same thing," I said, "every time. Nobody laughs at the fine print anymore. They never should have." That's the full story of the man who picked a legal pad in a room full of swords and rewrote the rules of the apocalypse one clause at a time. If you want to see what happens when the compact faces its first challenge from inside, when someone figures out that a binding agreement can be honored technically while being violated in spirit, that chapter is coming next. Make sure you're subscribed. The fine print always has